Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my rest of season running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're going to be talking about my top 36 running back rankings for the remainder of the year, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and the statistics that justify the reasons as to how I see them stacking up for the remainder of the season. Now, of course, the main purpose of a video as such is to give you guys a little bit more information as to which running backs perhaps you should be trading for. For those of you who are still trying to make a run at getting into your fantasy football playoffs, or potentially for those of you who have already secured a position and just want to bolster a team that will help you win a championship this season, hopefully the rankings on screen and the statistics that I present to you guys as we progress throughout today's video will give you guys more confidence on going after these players, acquiring them, and of course starting them to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. We'll begin by talking about matchups to the running back position, of course giving you guys a sense of how the strength of schedule looks like going for the remainder of the year in two different segments of time. The first one being weeks 11 through 14, and the other being the fantasy football playoffs weeks 15 through 17. After I present those two segments of time to you guys, we'll then transition into talking about our top 36 running back rankings. Of course, you can already see Austin Ekeler, our number one. Today's rankings are for a half PPR scoring format. If you want to skip to a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description. Before we begin, while you're down in the description looking for timestamps for a specific player, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season for the singular goal of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Tomorrow, we'll be live streaming here on the channel from 1 to 3 p.m. We'll also be live streaming Sunday morning, like we do every Sunday morning, 8 to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirchhoff will have updated rankings for week 10. And for those of you who need a little bit of help in terms of setting your lineups on Sunday morning, go ahead and stop on by within that 2-hour span. And of course, we'll have up-to-date rankings on screen for all four primary positions. We'll of course talk about defense and kicker rankings as well throughout the course of the live stream. So for those of you who are interested, join in and of course subscribe to the channel. Also, while you guys are down in the description, go ahead and check out Prize Picks. There's a link down there for those of you who are trying to play daily fantasy at your fingertips. Go ahead and do so via Prize Picks, whether it is the NFL, the NBA. You can go ahead and pick more or less on a given player statistic, put together multiple entries, and win yourself some prizes. So for those of you who are interested, check that out today. Use promo code Andrew when you sign up and make a first-time deposit, because if you use the code, the first-time deposit match is up to $100. So for those of you who are interested, check that out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about the matchups, and specifically the two spectrums of time I was referring to. The first one being weeks 11 through 14. Of course, we've already seen Thursday night's football game in week 10. So I thought, you know what, let's go ahead and let's look past that. Let's go ahead and look towards weeks 11 through 14 and what the future has in store for us in regards to how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics alone. When we go ahead and isolate those numbers, we find that the Miami Dolphins, for the remainder of the regular season, in terms of fantasy football, have the best schedule going forward, followed by the Washington Commanders, Dallas Cowboys, Cleveland Browns, and Baltimore Ravens. Now, this may give you a little bit of an insight as to where you want to go. Some of these teams obviously are going to be dealing with bye weeks up until week 14. So you may not have the services of, Alvin Kamara in week 14 to try to get into your fantasy football, playoffs. But just giving you some perspective on the remaining games in terms of the average strength of schedule. Now, the SOS average that you guys can see on screen is an average of those 4 teams that they're taking on, or potentially 3 in some of these scenarios because they have a bye week, and how many points per game those defenses have given up on average as a combined total of those potential teams within that 4-week span. So it may give you a little bit of an idea. Nobody has the worst possible matchups in the world. And reminder, this is just for rushing statistics alone. These numbers do not account any sort of potential upside that a running back has in the receiving game. So guys like Alvin Kamara, Austin Ekeler, Christian McCaffrey, who can catch the ball 9 times in a singular game, this does not account any of those potential statistics and or upside that they can get in terms of that value. Now, when you go ahead and transition into talking about weeks 15 through 17, for those of you who are already in the mix of making the fantasy playoffs, have already clinched a spot, you maybe have 7, 8 wins already. If you're in this position, you can already start looking towards teams like the Tennessee Titans as a team that you might want to go and trade with. You might want to go ahead and get Derrick Henry on roster because he takes on the LA Chargers, the Houston Texans, and the Dallas Cowboys in those 3 weeks. We know how incredible those matchups are. I'll mention that in an extended rate as we talk about Derrick Henry later on in today's episode. But just giving you guys a little bit of perspective as to which of these teams in the fantasy football playoffs weeks 15 through 17 have the most advantageous matchups upcoming. You can go ahead and pause, but we'll refer back to these statistics as we progress throughout today's video. Let's get into talking about our top 36 rankings, beginning with our number 1. It is, of course, Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler in a half PPR scoring format at this current moment in time is the number 1 running back in fantasy football. Considering he is literally averaging 7.5 receptions per game, he has scored 10 touchdowns in the last 5 games alone. He is on pace for not only breaking the potential record for most receptions by a running back in a singular season, which was set in 2019 by Christian McCaffrey. That record was at 116, if I'm not mistaken. He's on pace for 128. Not only that, he's also on pace for 21 total touchdowns scored. His career high last year in 2021 was 20 total touchdowns scored. And all we heard this offseason was people saying Austin Ekeler is not going to be able to get the goal line work like we expect. That time is come and gone. Austin Ekeler is the real deal. And the fact that the offensive pieces within the Chargers organization, whether it's Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, are going to continue to be out, continues to lend more and more opportunity in the receiving game and rushing attempts going in the direction of Austin Ekeler, and his value continues to increase. All right, moving on to our number 2, we have Christian McCaffrey, running back for the San Francisco 49ers. It is still weird to imagine him on the 49ers, but the last time we saw him in Week 8 participate with this offense, he was given unbelievable opportunity. Not only on the ground, because we know that this team wants to run the ball. Kyle Shanahan's offenses have always wanted to run the ball. I mean, you go back to Week 2 through 6 with Jimmy Garoppolo, this team, in terms of running back rushing attempts, has been averaging 19.8 running back rushing attempts per game prior to the arrival of Christian McCaffrey. So that you know that they want to hand him off the ball. But not only that, getting him 9 targets and 8 receptions in Week 8's contest against the LA Rams prior to their bye week was pretty pivotal, in my opinion, in terms of getting him incorporated and giving us a sense as to what kind of utilization Christian McCaffrey is going to see for the remainder of the year. It would not surprise me if Christian McCaffrey starts putting up 25 fantasy points per game and a half PPR henceforth on a per game average. And sometimes he's going to have more, sometimes he's going to have less. The touchdowns are obviously going to dictate that, coming off of a week in which he had 3 touchdowns total, 1 on the ground, 1 through the air, and another 1 passing. But overall, I think Christian McCaffrey on pace to look like his old 2019 self, which would be incredible for us. Moving on, let's talk about Derrick Henry, our number 3. Derrick Henry, like I mentioned before, has the easiest strength of schedule from weeks 15 through 17, the weeks that matter the most. He has the Los Angeles Chargers, like we all know, are giving up 6.03 yards per carry on average this season already. And by the time we get to week 15, they're not going to have a miraculous change. Like Joey Bosa coming back into this defense isn't going to make them improve that much more. They were bad when he was there. They're bad even when he's not. So going forward, it's an incredible matchup. Then we talk about Houston in week 16. Guys, the Houston Texans matchup has always been favorable for Derrick Henry. In the last 4 games he's played against the Houston Texans, his fantasy point contributions, 39.1, 39.4, 35, and 35.3. One of those recently earlier this season. And if you know already you're going to get 35 to 40 points from Derrick Henry in week 16, we can pretty much guarantee that if everybody else on your team is just average within that given week, you're getting to the fantasy football championship game in week 17, in which he'll take on Dallas. And even though they've got a strong defense, no one can stop Derrick Henry. Like, he's on a 5-game streak right now of over 100 total yards per game. He's scoring a boatload of touchdowns, and he's not going to stop running the rock, because that's the way this team gets into the playoffs. Moving on, let's talk about Saquon Barkley, our number 4. Saquon Barkley at this current moment in time has a really strong strength of schedule for the remainder of the regular season. Now, when you get into the fantasy playoffs, it gets a little bit more difficult, but in the next couple weeks here, he has Detroit in week 11, Dallas in week 12, Washington week 13, and Philadelphia in week 14. Now, I'm not even counting week 10 this week, in which he has the Houston Texans matchup on Sunday. The stretch of games he has here are going to continue to unlock Saquon Barkley into being one of the best running backs in the National Football League. And yes, he doesn't have as much receiving opportunity as some of these other guys, Austin Ekeler and Christian McCaffrey. He doesn't have as much touchdown upside as a Derrick Henry per se. But as of this current moment of time, the fact that he is number 2 amongst all running backs in terms of total opportunities per game, 24.75, and touches per game, 23.88, only second to Derrick Henry, leads me to believe that with great opportunity in terms of touches and incredible matchups upcoming, nothing's going to be able to stop Saquon Barkley. He could very easily finish as the number 1 remainder of the year. Would not surprise me. But at this current moment in time, with the offense and the way it's structured, I think he's pretty strong at number 4. Moving on to Nick Chubb, our number 5. Now, there's a couple things I want to mention in regards to Nick Chubb. First and foremost, whenever he's had a quote-unquote difficult or tough matchup this year, he's played pretty well. Most recently against the Cincinnati Bengals, that was supposed to be a tough matchup. I mean, we saw what they did to Dante Foreman. Of course, they got ran through by Nick Chubb, even with backup offensive linemen playing in that game. He played against Baltimore. He played very well against them as well. The New England matchup was probably the only game in which he struggled mightily. And quite frankly, outside of that game, 7 of his 8 games this season have been for 100 or more total yards. He's obviously number 1 amongst all running backs in terms of rushing touchdowns, 10 already this season. He's in an offense that, according to Pro Football Focus, is the number 1 run blocking team in the National Football League. if you continue to run the offense through him, as they typically will, as we've seen over the last 3 years with Kevin Stefanski, he's going to get his touches. He's going to have opportunity. And based on the remainder of the regular season schedule, weeks 11 through 14, he has the 8th best schedule getting to the fantasy playoffs. And by the time they get there, Deshaun Watson joins, and maybe it becomes easier to throw the ball considering they have that much more of a threat in the passing game. Moving on, let's talk about our number 6, Travis Etienne. Since week 7, Travis Etienne has been unbelievable without James Robinson. And for those of you who may be thinking, well, Andrew, didn't James Robinson suit up for that week 7 game? Yes, but he didn't see a singular touch within that offense. So in the last 3 weeks, without James Robinson impacting his overall fantasy, contributions, he has just been unstoppable. In fact, averaging 22 rushing attempts per game, 126 rushing yards per game, 1.33 touchdowns per game on the ground, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 9 receiving yards per game, and of course, 22.57 half PPR fantasy points per game. That is unbelievable statistics. No one can stop Travis Etienne. And their commitment to continuing to give him the ball, going from 14 to 24 to 28 rushing attempts in the last 3 weeks here, continues to build upon his success. Not only that, his fantasy football playoff strength of schedule, weeks 15 through 17, is one of the best. It's in fact the 4th best at the position, taking on Dallas in week 15, the Jets in week 16, and he has Houston in the championship Sunday week. This is a perfect recipe for success. Another one of these rookie backs. I consider Travis Etienne a rookie back because he didn't play in his rookie season technically because of the Liz Frank injury. But we're about to see a lot of rookie running backs that I'm mentioning coming forth. Let's talk about number 7, Alvin Kamara. Now, yes, he's not a rookie, but let's talk about what his potential is. Since his rookie year, he has been an unstoppable force. But over the course of this season already, with Andy Dalton under center, we have seen Alvin Kamara reach heights in terms of receiving work that he has not seen even with Drew Brees. Alvin Kamara, since week 5, since he pretty much came back from his rib injury, and of course, Andy Dalton took the starting mantle of this organization, Alvin Kamara has been the number 5 overall running back in fantasy football because he continues to give more and more opportunities to Alvin Kamara in terms of checkdowns. He's been averaging 7.6 targets per game and 6.2 receptions per game and 60 receiving yards per game throughout that span of time, 16.06 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. I think this all bodes well for the potential of Alvin Kamara for the remainder of the year. His fantasy football playoff schedule is against Atlanta, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. That's the 6th best amongst the running back position. Of course, if you continue to give him opportunities, he stays healthy, and this offense at least progresses into scoring more and more touchdowns on a weekly basis in comparison to what we've seen thus far. Of course, he's a fantastic option going forward. Moving on to Joe Mixon. Now, Joe Mixon could be lower than number 8 for the remainder of the season, but I just want to mention a couple things. As of thus far this season, he's the number 3 running back in terms of opportunities and touches per game, currently averaging 22.33 opportunities per game and 21.0 touches per game. Now, for those of you who are wondering what I mean by opportunities, that's a combination of both rushing attempts and targets given to the said player. Either way, he's only behind Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley, who have already been mentioned on today's video. But one of the primary reasons Joe Mixon has entered this conversation with the likes of a Derrick Henry or Saquon Barkley is because his receiving work. This season, he's going to set his career high in terms of total receptions, targets, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, as he is currently the number 4 running back in terms of total receptions this season already with 38. If he continues on that pace, and then continues to not only be the number 1 running back in terms of red zone rushing attempts this year, but also the number 1 running back in red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line with 12 attempts. If those numbers continue to compile for him, the rushing touchdowns will be there, the receiving upside will be there, and his fantasy value will continue to skyrocket. I wanted to go ahead and isolate 2 spectrums of time in specific in regards to Joe Mixon. Those 2 spectrums of time are weeks 1 through 8 of the 2021 year and weeks 1 through 8 of the 2022 year. Comparing those 2 spectrums of time just to get us a sense as to what kind of Joe Mixon we can expect for the remainder of this season. If you go back and you're not even counting week 9's explosive gain from the 2022 year, I'm just talking about weeks 1 through 8 of both seasons. We had Joe Mixon in 2021 put up 154 total touches for 720 total yards and 7 touchdowns between the first 8 weeks of 2021. This season, throughout that exact same game stretch, first 8 games, 163 total touches, so he's already got himself more touches, 646 total yards, a little bit less, but not a big deal, and 3 total touchdowns. So the biggest difference hasn't been total opportunity, because it's certainly been there. It's been total yardage and touchdowns. Now that we've gone ahead and hit our stride, and we just saw him completely demolish the Carolina Panthers, if this organization is going to get back to committing to the run and want to continue to find success in doing so, especially down in the goal line for Joe Mixon, he has already equaled out his fantasy point total for the first 9 weeks of last year compared to this year, thanks to his 50-point performance. And though you may think that performance was an outlier, I find it to be, one of those performances that just compiled all the opportunities that he had early in the season that he quite frankly just couldn't complete. There were so many times early in the season where he had multiple opportunities handed back to back to him on the 1-yard line and he wasn't able to get in. The fact that he does it all in 1 week doesn't really bother me. I think going forward, he has a lot of value. This team just got to commit to the run. Moving on, let's talk about Kenneth Walker, our number 9. Speaking of rookie running backs, so Kenneth Walker is in a extremely advantageous position considering this team has found a lot of success already this year. In a rebuild with 2 rookie offensive tackles, they're completely torching defenses in the running game. Of course, they use a lot of 2 and 3 tight end sets, and of course, they even bring in a couple fullbacks here and there, but there's no one else that is taking away opportunity from Kenneth Walker. Since we saw, of course, Rashad Penny, who went down with his season-ending injury, go down in week 5, from week 6 through 9, while Kenneth Walker has been the starter of this team, he's been the number 2 overall running back in fantasy football, averaging 21.2 fantasy points per game. And he's been able to accomplish that because of the opportunity he has been given in the last 4 games, getting 24.25 opportunities per game and 23.5 touches per game. In the last 4 contests, 3 of them has consisted of 110 or more total yards within those given games. And not only that, in the last 4 games he has played, he has scored a total of 6 touchdowns, some on the ground, some through the air. Either way, he's one of the most talented backs in the league, and I don't think he's slowing down within this offense for the remainder of the year. Let's move on to Rhamondre Stevenson, a guy that had himself a lot of opportunity handed because of the injury of Dameon Harris earlier this year. But hey, opportunity is nothing unless you can act upon it, and that's exactly what Rhamondre Stevenson has done thus far this season. Coming out and immediately making an impact within this offense, whether it's on the ground or through the air, and even as a pass blocking threat in order to protect his quarterbacks. He's done everything at a very high level. Since week 3, it's a crazy number, but since week 3, Rhamondre Stevenson is quite literally the number 5 overall running back in fantasy in terms of total points scored. He's been averaging 17.53 fantasy points per game while getting himself 16 rushing attempts per game and 5.6 targets per game, which led to 4.6 receptions per game, while also averaging 0.71 touchdowns per game and obviously over 110 yards per game. The amount of statistics he's putting up is it's top tier. And that is why I continue to maintain him within my top 10 at the position. Last time we talked about rest of season running back rankings, I had him at 11. He continues to move up because I certainly believe that he has put the entire back and forth between him and Dameon Harris behind him. He is the lead back of this team, and going forward within a run-first offense, he should continue to find success. Moving on to DeAndre Swift, our number 11. DeAndre Swift, in fact, got a full practice designation earlier today. So I'm willing to go ahead and put him into the top 12 conversation because you got to remember, his weeks 15 through 17 strength of schedule is one of the best in the league. In fact, it's 5th amongst all running backs, considering they take on the Jets, Carolina Panthers, and Chicago Bears throughout that 3-week span. Not only that, once you go ahead and get him back at a full healthy rotation where he's getting his maximum amount of touches, you go back to week 1, it'll give you a little bit of a glimpse as to what we can expect from DeAndre Swift. In that game, week 1, earlier this season, he had 18 total touches. Anytime throughout the course of his entire career, 2020 through 2022, anytime throughout his career he's been given 15 or more touches in a game, he's averaging 18.67 fantasy points per game. He's one of the best running backs in the National Football League. And even with Jamaal Williams in the wings, stealing some touchdowns here and there, I mean, every running back has to deal with that. There's going to be a lot of running backs that, have the full backfield to themselves. There's always going to be the impact of like Kareem Hunt digging into the work of a Nick Chubb within a given week, or Alexander Mattison digging into Dalvin Cook's overall upside. It happens. In either way, I still believe DeAndre Swift going forward within this offense is a fantastic top 12 option under the assumption that he remains healthy for the remainder of the year. Let's talk about Josh Jacobs to close out our RB1s. Josh Jacobs, with Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow going to the IR, may, provide a little bit more value to him. But let's be honest, Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow have done nothing all season long. They have not been a factor in this offense throughout those 3 games in which he had 140 plus yards, and they will continue to no longer be a factor within the offense. So it doesn't really make a difference in my mind. Going forward, the only thing that I'm looking for in regards to Josh Jacobs is them getting back to running the ball. In the 2 games that the Raiders have won this year, he went for over 140 rushing yards. And the only other game where he went for over 140 rushing yards was when they lost to the Kansas City Chiefs of all teams by 1 singular point. In my opinion, if this team wants to win games, they have to run the offense through Josh Jacobs. And I'm hoping that they're going to exactly accomplish that because, quite frankly, behind this offensive line who can't pass block, which is the primary reason why Derek Carr struggles so often. If you can go ahead and set up play action, great, but you have to establish a running game first and foremost. And then the passing game can thrive off that. But as of right now, Josh Jacobs has to be the focal point. Otherwise, he could be a little bit lesser value going forward within the offense. Moving on to our number 13, we have Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook has been fantastic ever since he took that beatdown in week 2 against the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't remember if you guys actually recall that game, but for those of you who don't, it was a Monday night game in which the entire Vikings offense didn't play well. And that's the only game they've lost this season, in fact. Either way, after that game, weeks 3 through 9, Dalvin Cook has been unstoppable. In fact, averaging 16.38 fantasy points per game since then and averaging 4.77 yards per carry. Those numbers are exactly what we wanted to see this preseason. And if he can continue that streak, by all means, it's going to be perfect for Dalvin Cook. And I don't think anybody's complaining about Dalvin Cook as of late. The only thing that you guys may be complaining about is Alexander Mattison stealing some touchdowns. In fact, since week 3, Alexander Mattison has scored 3 touchdowns. And yes, I understand that that's going to make a huge impact. That's 18 points out of his overall fantasy point contribution. But in my mind, if the sacrifice we have to make to have a full healthy season of Dalvin Cook requires a couple touchdowns be siphoned away from him throughout the remainder of the season, by all means, I'll take it. I'd much rather have the remainder of the season with a full healthy Dalvin Cook than him get a couple more touchdowns in a couple more games and then him miss his normal 3 to 4 games within a given year. I'm not interested in that. I'd like him to stay healthy. And if they can do so by giving more touches to Alexander Mattison, doesn't bother me in any sort of capacity. Let's move on. Let's talk about Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor has had a full week of practice, full designation, no problem. Deion Jackson's hurt, and it looks like Jonathan Taylor's back as the starting running back of this team now that he's healthy. That all being said, I have a lot of concerns regarding not only their new head coach, Jeff Saturday, but their play caller / offensive coordinator, which now is a guy that has never called plays in the National Football League. He's a 30-year-old gentleman that obviously is going to be thrown into a stressful situation. This entire offense could either be just as good as they were or completely go off the rails. And I don't know which one of the two it's going to be. And if they go completely off the rails and they start losing games by a major margin because they cannot score points, and even though their defense is good, Shaq Leonard's going back to the injured reserve, there is a lot of potential for failure within this team. And if we begin to see any sort of hesitation from this organization in terms of giving him touches going forward, it could very easily lead to the organization thinking, you know what, we don't want to put too many miles on his body. We want to keep him for future years. We can potentially, vie for a playoff spot and a championship in future seasons. Let's pull him. That is the biggest concern. I don't want to be in a situation where when I get to week 16 of my fantasy football playoffs, we end up seeing that Jonathan Taylor is not available for us. And that is why I have him at number 14, because the looming threat of something like that occurring is always going to be on my mind, considering the entire dysfunctionality of the Colts organization. That all being said, if they continue to approach and maybe shift the offense around a little bit in future weeks and allow Sam Ehlinger to be a rushing threat, you got to remember his final 2 years at Texas had over 1,000 rushing yards combined and over 15 rushing touchdowns. If you can get a run-first, run-only offense behind one of the better offensive lines in the league in terms of run blocking, we could find success. But again, there's a lot of ifs and quite frankly, a lot of speculation that may not pan out, which provides a little bit less comfort and a little bit less stability in comparison to these other racks I've mentioned already. Moving on to Dameon Pierce, number 15. Dameon Pierce, another rookie running back that has been incredible. Since week 3, since being the full-time running back for this organization, has averaged 24 opportunities per game and 23.33 touches per game, while averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, the number 13 overall running back. And I think this is a very fair position to have him at number 15. Because yes, he doesn't have as much receiving upside or touchdown upside as these other running backs. And quite frankly, he doesn't have the teams that surround these guys. He doesn't have as good of an offensive line or a quarterback or an offense or offensive coordinator than these other organizations and running backs and the opportunities that they're being given. But the fact that he's been given so much, potential volume has separated from the pack. When you give a running back 23 touches per game, they're going to find success. One way or another, they will. And the fact that he's been able to score 4 touchdowns in the last 6 games that he's participated in, averaging about 3 receptions per week, that is enough to keep him in this top 15 conversation. And once we continue to go forward, regardless of what his strength of schedule looks like for the remainder of the year, he's absolutely in an advantageous position to continue to find success within this offense. Moving on to D'Onta Foreman, who's coming off of an incredible week last night. Again, he started off Thursday night with a banger game, putting up another 100+ yard performance and a touchdown. In fact, in 3 out of his last 4 games, he has put up 118 or more rushing yards, and he has scored 4 touchdowns in those last 4 games. Overall, D'Onta Foreman is going to be the primary back. From weeks 7 through 10, he has already proven that, as he is literally averaging 17.35 fantasy points per game throughout that span of time, that 4-game stretch. Now, when you look towards the future, Chuba Hubbard coming back. We saw Chuba Hubbard last night. He didn't get nearly as many touches as we would have expected in terms of impacting his overall value. And when we go forward, looking at the Carolina Panthers running backs having the 10th easiest playoff strength of schedule for weeks 15 through 17, why not go ahead and trust in D'Onta Foreman to not only get us to the playoffs, but potentially be the fantasy waiver wire pickup of the year. A guy that has already established himself as the number 1 of his team, and even last season has proven to us that this level of consistency is going to remain. You go back to last year, weeks 12 through 18, without Derrick Henry in the Tennessee Titans lineup, we saw D'Onta Foreman take the mantle as a starting running back role and was averaging 12.2 fantasy points per game throughout a 6-game stretch. There is so much potential within this young back. I understand the Achilles injury from long ago was something that derailed his early career, but he's back and better than ever. Moving on, let's talk about Aaron Jones at number 17. Now, Aaron Jones' value ultimately is going to revolve around this current ankle injury that he is dealing with. He sustained this injury this last week in week 9, and of course, saw a season low in terms of total snaps played with 30 because of said injury. If this injury is as serious as it could potentially be, he could be out for a couple weeks here. But if in fact he potentially dodged the serious nature of an injury and is only going to have, a little bit of limited practice, maybe limited for 1 to 2 weeks and we good to go, then I think we dodged a bullet in that regard. Because the last time I talked about Aaron Jones in terms of getting him in terms of a trade was back in week 7. The 2 weeks following week 7's conversation that I had with you guys throughout that, trade target episode, he put up 24.1 fantasy points and 17.7. So back-to-back weeks of incredible weeks, and then obviously gets hurt. The injury is a variable that we can't take into account or predict in that matter. But going forward, when we're valuing him, this injury is something that I've kept in my mind. And if it's going to impact his overall touches, it could be something that we might want to be a little bit wary of. Mainly because last year when he got injured and he missed time, it really gave a lot of confidence in the organization going back to A.J. Dillon and giving him more and more touches within a weekly basis, which could happen once again here. Just hoping it doesn't. Moving on to Miles Sanders, to finish off our top 18 conversation at the running back position for the remainder of the season. We have Miles Sanders, who just a season ago at this current moment in time had 0 touchdowns to his name and ended up finishing the 2021 year without a singular touchdown. But this year, within an undefeated offense, within an undefeated organization, behind the best offensive line in the game, in a scheme that honestly promotes one of the best rushing attacks in the entire National Football League, he currently has 6 touchdowns scored already. In 6 of his 8 games, in those games in which he scores touchdowns, he's had 10 or more points every single time. If you continue to be associated with one of the best offenses in the league, and they're going to continue to give you those goal line opportunities, by all means, the guy's already getting himself 15 plus touches per game on average. Now that you're accompanying touchdowns because of how effective this offense is on a weekly basis, it continues to increase his overall potential and maintains his value within this conversation. All right, let's go ahead and move on and let's talk about the second half of the running back position, number 19 through 36, beginning with Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard is a guy that in my mind, if in fact this weekend's game against the Green Bay Packers goes as well as I anticipate it doing so, I could easily see Tony Pollard jumping over Aaron Jones and Miles Sanders in my rankings back into that top 17 conversation of the running back position, currently due to the fact that we do have Zeke dealing with an injury. If Zeke's knee injury provides more opportunity to Tony Pollard, the levels of which opportunity increases his overall potential for fantasy success is unbelievable. This season already, with Zeke in the lineup, he was averaging about 11.14 touches per game. That's a pretty decent number, 11 touches per game, averaging about 9.36 fantasy points per game. Okay, not the worst, but when you go ahead and talk about 2019 through 2022, throughout Pollard's career, anytime he's been given 14 or more touches in a game, he's averaging 17.59 fantasy points per game. There is so much potential for upside. There is so much home run hitting upside with Tony Pollard. The fact that currently in the league, he's amongst the top 3 in yards per attempt and is number 1 amongst all running backs in yards per carry after contact. It is unbelievable, and he needs more opportunity. I'm just hoping the organization gives it to him. Moving on to our number 20, we have, of course, Leonard Fournette. Leonard Fournette is a little bit of a tricky situation here because, yes, I like Leonard Fournette a lot, but he just isn't being granted the opportunities we have seen in the past. His strength of schedule is favorable for the remainder of the year, like we've talked about earlier, but if you're not going to get the receiving upside like he was able to dominate last year, if he's not able to run the ball effectively, he can't be on the field. Just a couple stats that I wanted to mention to kind of give you guys an idea as to why I have him so low. 6 games this season already, he has averaged less than 3 yards per carry. So 6 different contests where he left that game when the clock hit 0 at the end of the fourth quarter, where he averaged less than 3 yards per carry. That is unacceptable for Leonard Fournette. Not only that, in the last 3 games alone, he has 26 total rushing attempts. You go back to week 2 of earlier this season, he had 24 rushing attempts in that singular game. He is not being utilized on the ground. He's not getting enough targets through the air, and he's not scoring touchdowns. The ineffectiveness of this offense as a whole diminishes his value. And if, in fact, we can't get back to Leonard Fournette being playoff Lenny, being the guy that's touching the ball 20 times per game, finding the end zone twice a week, I can't, consciously promote him as someone that you need to go after. I think, yes, he will probably stay within this lower end RB2 conversation, but his upside is purely related to all those different opportunities he's lacking currently. Moving on to Cordarrelle Patterson. I think Cordarrelle Patterson is a stud. And we all know that what we saw last night from him is not something that we're going to continue to see on a weekly basis. Every running back has a bad week. It happens. But it just so happened that Cordarrelle Patterson had to do it to us on national television Thursday night, and it was rough. Either way, when you go ahead and look at the opportunities he's been given and the amount of production he has already demonstrated to us, he's already hit his career high in terms of rushing attempts and rushing yards this season. Now that they're reincorporating him within the offense on a short week, I understand it's tough to play against the Carolina Panthers just a couple of days after playing against the Los Angeles Chargers in a tough game. But overall, I expect Cordarrelle Patterson to continue to be the number one option in a run-first attack that, quite frankly, is a successful running team. With Marcus Mariota there, with behind a better offensive line than they have been in seasons past in terms of running the ball, I absolutely anticipate Cordarrelle Patterson to continue to be in this RB2 conversation going forward. It's not going to slow him down. Moving on, let's talk about James Conner. So James Conner is in a position here where he is going to be given opportunity. And if, in fact, Kyler Murray's current injury is going to impact him in a sense to where he's given more opportunity, that's an absolute plus. Earlier this season, in the weeks that he's been healthy and played, he's averaging over 4 yards per carry and 4 targets per game. If you're going to give him more opportunity on the ground through the air, the biggest difference maker now is going to be whether or not he can find the end zone. And these offensive woes that this entire Cardinals organization has seen this season has obviously not led to a couple touchdowns per game for him. But if, in fact, Kyler Murray's hamstring injury leads to more running or potentially leads to Colt McCoy coming in for a couple weeks here, that absolutely will lead to more potential success for James Conner. He's associated with an offense that can certainly score. They just got to get him around the end zone, and he'll find his fantasy success. Moving on to number 23, David Montgomery. David Montgomery has one of the best strength of schedules prior to Week 14. Of course, they have a Week 14, but prior to that, Atlanta, New York Jets, Green Bay Packers, and I didn't even mention this week's game against the Detroit Lions. If this team continues to run the ball as effectively as they have, not only through Justin Fields, but on the ground with David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert, Montgomery is going to continue to be a stud option. In the last 3 games, while Justin Fields has gone off, scored a touchdown in each of those 3 games on the ground, and obviously been a monster in the sense of scrambling, we've continued to see David Montgomery still average 16 touches per game. And if he continues to do that, fantasy success is going to arrive for him, whether it's on the ground, through the air, and especially down in the red zone. Moving on to Jamaal Williams. I still believe that even with DeAndre Swift back, Jamaal Williams has value. You go back to week 1. In that week where Swift was going off, Jamaal Williams would come in, get himself 10 rushing attempts, and still manage to fall into the end zone twice. I truly do believe that this organization wants to use him as their goal line back. He's their spiritual and, honestly, verbal leader at times. And if they want to continue to get him in the end zone, they're going to. I wouldn't put it past this coaching staff to make a terrible decision as such to impact their fantasy teams, but they got to do whatever they have to do to, sleep at night and continue to, maintain their job. So I'm not going to blame them for what they do. Either way, Jamaal Williams will have value. So even with the return of DeAndre Swift, do not be worried. Moving on to Michael Carter, our number 25. Michael Carter has one of the best strength of schedules between weeks 15 through 17, as the Jets are currently tied for the 10th best playoff strength of schedule, taking on Detroit in week 15, fantastic matchup, Jacksonville in week 16, beautiful, and Seattle in week 17. Again, 3 back-to-back-to-back fantastic matchups for the young running back. And the way that they utilized him this last week in week 9, of course, he's on a bye week this week, but the utilization he was given, 13 rushing attempts for 76 yards, had himself a rushing touchdown, got himself a target for a reception, 13 total touches, and he got himself 15.1 fantasy points. I talked about this earlier when Breece Hall went down with his season-ending ACL injury. Michael Carter, in his career, when he's been given 13 or more touches in a game, the guy's averaging over 13 or more fantasy points per game. If the opportunity is there, his fantasy point production will certainly follow. Moving on to Jeff Wilson Jr., our number 26. I personally expect Jeff Wilson Jr. to overtake this backfield and be the number one option. Not only has he shown the success from last week's performance, but he looks like the better running back in terms of burst, in terms of home run upside, and going forward, in terms of the receiving work that this offense is going to progress with. They brought in Chase Edmonds to be that. Obviously, Chase Edmonds wasn't able to provide any sort of production in that regard, and obviously sent a lot of potential targets in the direction of Mostert. But I think going forward, all of that is going to be contributed to Jeff Wilson's scoreline, which makes him a pretty good high-end RB3 option for the remainder of the season. Even though this offense is predicated around getting the ball to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, Jeff Wilson will still get his share. Moving on to our number 27, we have Najee Harris. Now, in the last couple of days, we've heard a couple rumors that have begun to heat up in regards to Jalen Warren getting more touches within this offense. And it wouldn't surprise me because as of right now, unfortunately, Najee Harris is on pace for 280 total touches by the end of the year. Last season, in 2021, he had 378 total touches, nearly 100 more touches in 2021 that he is currently on pace for in 2022. Our expectation this offseason was 400 or more total touches from Najee Harris. And obviously, Tomlin made it a concerted effort to not give him the ball as much because they want to save him for future years. They knew they were going to be a bad football team this year. And with that in mind, they decided, you know what? Let's not utilize Najee Harris to his maximum capacity. Let's not run this man into the ground and let this young running back carry our team for future seasons. So as of right now, with the Pittsburgh Steelers reserving his overall touches, it reserves me from wanting him on my fantasy team. Moving on to Gus Edwards, our number 28. Once, in fact, Gus Edwards comes back from the bye week and the hamstring strain, I think he'll be immediately the number one. Now, if we get Dobbins back, we have Drake in this backfield, and we get a little bit of a rotation, that could be difficult for his individual value, but I absolutely believe that Edwards is going to get the bulk majority of the touches. Dobbins has shown himself a couple weeks here and there of better performances, but I don't think he's going to be himself until next year. And that's when we want to probably draft him because it typically takes a full season after the ACL injury to get back to being, the right guy, just like we saw with Saquon recently. And of course, with Dalvin Cook years back, of course, sustained the injury, had a rough year, then he went off and the rest was history. I absolutely believe that Gus Edwards is going to be the lead back of this team. And when he is, there's a lot of touchdown upside that is associated with that opportunity. And going forward, she'll be able to find the end zone a couple times here. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott, again, if in fact he's going to be a shell of himself, similar to the way he was in 2021 after his knee injury, and he lost a lot of burst and wasn't able to get, what was it, like a 12-week streak in 2021 of less than 48 rushing yards, something like that. It was a crazy number. I think we could very easily see that. Now, he's going to play. Don't get me wrong. He's going to play. He's going to have third down pass blocking opportunities. He's going to have a couple goal line rushing attempts. He's going to run the ball on first down, second down, third. It doesn't matter. He's going to get his touches, but it's certainly not going to be as much as you would anticipate. Moving on to our number 30, we have Devin Singletary. Now, Devin Singletary could very easily flip the switch and just like last season, from weeks 15 through 18, be a fantastic running back. I mean, you go back to 2021, throughout that 4-game streak, 15, 16, 17, and 18, he had produced 16 or more fantasy points per game in every single one of those 4 consecutive contests. Now, this is all being mentioned under the assumption that maybe we see Josh Allen be limited with the elbow. And if that's going to be the case and running game continues to be a primary option within this offense, then by all means, Devin Singletary has delivered in the past and continue to do so in the future. I don't expect Nyheim Hines to impact that overall value. Could get a couple touches here and there, but overall, Devin Singletary would be perfectly fine under that assumption. Otherwise, he's a lower end, middle of the pack RB3. Moving on to James Robinson at number 31. We know that the reason the Jets traded for him is because they have a run-first attack and they want to continue to utilize that. When you go back to week 9 and saw him get 13 rushing attempts, more than Michael Carter, wasn't as effective, obviously only had 48 rushing yards, but got himself a receiving touchdown for over 10 fantasy points. It leads me to believe that this run-first attack is going to continue to try to do that. Play good defense, run the ball first and foremost, and whether it is Michael Carter or James Robinson, of course, with the easier strength of schedule for the remainder of the year, they could find a lot of opportunity in fantasy points. Moving on to Antonio Gibson. Gibson will be the lead receiving back of this team. And with that much value continuing to be, replenished into his overall baseline of production within a given week, on top of the fact that he's getting about 9 to 11 rushing attempts per game, with Brian Robinson still there, that leads me to believe that he will easily be the more valuable back in this backfield, especially when we're talking about a half PPR scoring format. Obviously, I'd like to say that his offensive line or the re-addition of Carson Wentz later in the year, if it does happen, would help him. But as of right now, the Washington Commanders are in a tough spot, and so is their overall fantasy value. Moving on to Kareem Hunt. Again, we know that he has handcuff upside. If something is to happen to Nick Chubb, he immediately steps in and is an incredible play. Outside of that, he's typically going to score himself 7 fantasy points without a touchdown. And if he scores a touchdown within a given week, he'll score himself double-digit points and be a top 24 option. Unless we get those touchdowns, it's tough. But maybe the addition of Deshaun Watson opens up more opportunity in the receiving game for him, or potentially just provides this team more scoring upside on a weekly basis, which could provide more touchdown opportunities down in the red zone for Kareem Hunt, which we know him and Nick Chubb, they split up, far too many opportunities down there for our comfort. Moving on to Brian Robinson. Now, Brian Robinson, again, it's the same conversation that we just had with Antonio Gibson. We're not 100% certain on this offense, and we can't, without a doubt in our minds, say that they're going to be successful in running the ball, but I'm sure that they're going to run enough to provide enough value for these guys to be decent RB3 options. Do I want them on my team? No, I don't like their strength of schedules. And I leave them at this bottom of this conversation because, yes, they're going to score regardless of whether I want them to or not. They're passively going to score as the weeks progress. And when they do, they'll have fantasy value, just not enough for me to acknowledge it to a point where I'm going after these players. Moving on to our number 35, Raheem Mostert. I have moved Raheem Mostert down here because, again, I really do believe that Jeff Wilson is the better running back. I could be totally wrong. We could show up this week and Raheem Mostert outsnaps him 90% to 10%, and the touches follow as such. And Raheem Mostert is a starting back. I could be mistaken on that factor. But as of right now, I'm pretty confident in terms of the eye test. Jeff Wilson has passed it, while on the other end of the spectrum, Raheem Mostert, not as much. Moving on to the final player I wanted to mention is Khalil Herbert. Speaking of passing the eye test, Khalil Herbert at times this year has been the better running back in this backfield for Chicago. If they can get down into the later half of the year, and we're talking about stashing someone for week 17, Khalil Herbert could be a stud option against Detroit in week 17 as a Hail Mary flex option within the given week. Otherwise, he's going to get his touches as the season progresses. But overall, not the most upside value considering David Montgomery's already touching the ball 17 times per game. We're getting Justin Fields running the ball 10 times plus per game. It requires a better matchup and or a better overall game script for Khalil Herbert to be utilized at the sense that we want him to. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Again, those are my top 36 running back rankings for the rest of the 2022 season. If you like today's content, be sure to click the like button down below. Of course, subscribe if you guys have not yet already. Check out Prize Picks. Check out the Patreon for those of you who want unlimited questions answered and my weekly rankings for the remainder of the season. All of that taken into account. Tomorrow we'll be live streaming 1 to 3 p.m. and of course on Sunday from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time with updated rankings. Thank you everybody for watching. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.